Archaeology is often presented as a science of certainty. Through textbooks, museums, and documentaries, it creates the impression that the ancient world has been carefully measured, catalogued, and explained. Timelines appear stable, historical periods seem clearly defined, and the past feels orderly and complete. In reality, archaeology is not a direct record of human history. It is a discipline built almost entirely on what has survived. What we study today is not what once existed in full, but what time, climate, chance, and human activity have allowed to remain visible. Most of the ancient world is gone. Entire settlements disappeared without leaving recognizable traces. Organic materials decayed long ago. Wooden structures collapsed and vanished. Metals were melted down and reused. Stone blocks were dismantled and incorporated into later buildings. What remains is uneven, fragmented, and often disconnected from its original context. Archaeology does not observe the past directly. It reconstructs it indirectly. From broken pottery, tool marks, architectural foundations, and spatial patterns, researchers build interpretive models of how people may have lived, worked, and organized their societies. These models are not photographs of history. They are reasoned approximations. Every archaeological interpretation depends on assumptions. Assumptions about how materials behave over time, about how societies typically function, about what similarities or differences mean when comparing cultures separated by centuries or even millennia. These assumptions are necessary, but they also shape the conclusions that follow. Methods matter deeply. The tools available to archaeologists influence what questions can be asked and what answers seem plausible. Before modern dating techniques, timelines were based largely on stylistic comparisons and written sources. Later, radiocarbon dating transformed chronology, only to be refined again as calibration methods improved. Each technological advance has corrected earlier conclusions, sometimes by hundreds or thousands of years. This constant revision is not a weakness. It is a defining feature of archaeology. Knowledge in this field is provisional. What is considered established today may be questioned tomorrow as new evidence or methods emerge. Archaeology is therefore not a finished story, but an ongoing process of testing and correction. At the same time, this process faces unavoidable limits. Evidence does not survive evenly across time or geography. Some regions are richly documented, while others remain almost silent. Some periods leave abundant traces, while others appear nearly invisible. Absence of evidence does not necessarily mean absence of activity, yet it strongly shapes historical narratives. The result is a past that is partially illuminated and partially obscured. Archaeology can reveal extraordinary detail in certain places, while leaving vast gaps elsewhere. These gaps are not failures of effort. They are structural limits of the material record itself. Understanding archaeology means accepting this uncertainty. It means recognizing that history, as we know it, is not a complete reconstruction of the past, but a carefully assembled framework built from what remains. And it is within these limits that the study of ancient Egypt becomes especially revealing. Archaeological knowledge is shaped not only by what is discovered, but by what is missing. Evidence does not survive in a complete or balanced way. It is filtered by time, environment, and circumstance long before it reaches modern researchers. As a result, archaeology works with an incomplete archive, one defined as much by absence as by presence. Material remains enter the archaeological record through a process of selection that no human controls. Climate determines preservation. Dry deserts protect organic materials, while humid regions erase them almost entirely. Floods, earthquakes, erosion, and volcanic activity destroy layers of occupation. Human actions further reshape the record through construction, agriculture, looting, and reuse of materials. What survives is not representative of the past as it was lived, but of the conditions under which remains endured. Even when artifacts survive, they rarely remain in their original context. Layers are disturbed. Objects move between strata. Later activity cuts through earlier occupation. This makes interpretation difficult. Archaeologists rely on stratigraphy, the study of layers, to establish relative chronology, but stratigraphy itself is vulnerable to disruption. A single disturbance can reorder centuries of material. The archaeological record is also geographically uneven. Some regions have been extensively excavated for generations, while others remain unexplored due to political instability, environmental challenges, or lack of funding. What is known about the ancient world often reflects modern priorities rather than historical importance. Areas that attract attention receive interpretation, while others remain silent on the map of history. Written sources, when they exist, introduce further complications. Texts are not neutral records. They reflect the perspectives, intentions, and limitations of their authors. Many ancient societies left no writing at all. Others recorded only elite viewpoints, religious ideals, or political propaganda. When texts survive, they rarely align neatly with material evidence, forcing scholars to negotiate between conflicting sources. Dating techniques, though powerful, are not absolute. Radiocarbon dating provides ranges, not exact years. Calibration curves adjust results as scientific understanding improves. Thermoluminescence, dendrochronology, and other methods each have specific limitations and margins of error. Dates are estimates refined over time, not fixed points etched into the past. Because evidence is fragmentary, archaeology relies heavily on inference. Patterns are identified across limited data sets. Analogies are drawn between cultures that may share only superficial similarities. Hypotheses are constructed to explain gaps that cannot be filled directly. These practices are necessary, but they also introduce uncertainty into every conclusion. This uncertainty does not invalidate archaeological knowledge, but it defines its boundaries. Archaeology can describe what is probable, plausible, or consistent with available data. It cannot always describe what is certain. The further back in time researchers look, the wider these margins become. Understanding the limits of evidence is essential for interpreting the past responsibly. It reminds us that archaeological reconstructions are not final answers, but models built under constraint. And in no field is this tension between evidence and uncertainty more visible than in the study of ancient Egypt, where material abundance coexists with profound gaps in understanding. Establishing when events occurred is one of the central objectives of archaeology. Chronology provides the structural framework upon which all historical interpretation depends. Without a temporal anchor, artifacts lose much of their explanatory power, and archaeological sites become disconnected accumulations of material rather than intelligible records of past human activity unfolding over time. Despite its importance, archaeological dating is far more uncertain and interpretive than it is often portrayed. Most dating methods do not identify exact moments in history. Instead, they produce probability ranges derived from physical processes that are imperfectly understood and continuously refined. As scientific knowledge advances, These ranges are adjusted, recalibrated, and sometimes substantially revised. Radiocarbon dating illustrates these limitations clearly. The method measures the decay of carbon isotopes in organic materials, but the results depend on calibration curves that reflect historical variations in atmospheric carbon levels. As these curves are updated, dates that were once considered reliable may shift by decades or even centuries. What appears precise in publication is often far more flexible in practice. Other dating techniques introduce additional uncertainties. Dendrochronology depends on preserved wood and continuous regional tree ring sequences that do not exist everywhere. Thermoluminescence estimates the last heating of certain materials, yet it carries broad margins of error. Relative dating methods such as stratigraphy and typology establish sequences rather than absolute dates, requiring further assumptions to translate order into chronology. Interpretation plays a decisive role at every stage. Archaeologists must judge whether layers are undisturbed, whether samples truly belong to the context being dated, and whether objects have been reused or displaced. A piece of charcoal may predate the structure in which it is found. A ceremonial object may remain in circulation for generations before deposition. These factors complicate the relationship between an artifact and the date assigned to it. Assumptions, therefore, become embedded within chronological models. Researchers assume patterns of settlement continuity, rates of material deposition, and cultural stability across time. These assumptions are necessary to construct usable timelines, but they also narrow the range of acceptable interpretations. Once a chronology becomes widely adopted, new evidence is often interpreted within its framework rather than used to challenge its underlying structure. Error is not an occasional flaw in archaeology. It is an inherent condition of working with fragmentary evidence. Dates are revised, chronologies are reorganized, and period boundaries are redrawn as new methods and discoveries emerge. This process reflects the self-correcting nature of scientific inquiry, but it also underscores the provisional status of archaeological knowledge. The further archaeology extends into deep time, the wider these uncertainties become. Early periods are defined by fewer samples, broader date ranges, and greater reliance on indirect evidence. Chronologies stretch and compress as researchers attempt to impose order on limited data. What appears stable in diagrams often remains fluid beneath the surface. Understanding archaeological dating therefore requires accepting its limits. Timelines are not immutable truths, but interpretive models shaped by evidence, probability, and assumption. They provide structure rather than certainty. When applied to long and complex civilizations, these constraints play a decisive role in shaping how the past is divided, explained, and ultimately understood. Egyptology is often perceived as one of the most complete and well-documented branches of archaeology. The monuments are monumental, the inscriptions abundant, and the civilization itself spans thousands of years. To many observers, ancient Egypt appears unusually well understood when compared to other ancient cultures. Yet this impression is shaped not only by evidence, but by the structure of the discipline itself. Egyptology is not merely the study of ancient Egypt. It is a system of interpretation built over generations. Its foundations were laid during the 19th and early 20th centuries, at a time when archaeology was closely tied to colonial expansion, museum collecting, and the desire to construct linear narratives of human progress. Early frameworks established chronologies, dynastic sequences, and interpretive conventions that continue to shape research today. Once such frameworks become established, they acquire institutional weight. Textbooks, museums, academic departments, and funding structures reinforce specific models of interpretation. New discoveries are rarely interpreted in isolation. They are evaluated in relation to existing chronologies, accepted dynastic timelines, and long-standing assumptions about social organization, religion, and technology. This process provides coherence, but it also creates inertia. Egyptian history is traditionally divided into clearly defined periods: early dynastic, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and Late Period. These divisions are useful analytical tools, but they can also oversimplify reality. Human societies do not transform overnight. Political change, cultural continuity, and technological development often overlap across these artificial boundaries. Yet periodization can create the illusion of sharp transitions where gradual change was more likely. Written sources further complicate interpretation. Egypt left behind an extraordinary number of inscriptions, reliefs, and papyri. But these texts were not written as objective historical records. They were produced for religious, political, and ideological purposes. Royal inscriptions emphasize order, continuity, and divine legitimacy. Failures, internal conflicts, and social disruptions are often minimized or omitted entirely. Silence in the texts does not necessarily indicate stability. Hieroglyphic writing itself presents limitations. It is a complex, symbolic system that combines phonetic, ideographic, and religious elements. Meaning often depends on context, convention, and cultural knowledge that may no longer be fully accessible. Translation is an interpretive act, not a mechanical process. Subtle shifts in meaning can significantly alter how texts are understood. Material evidence introduces additional challenges. Monumental architecture dominates the Egyptian archaeological record, but it reflects the priorities of the state and elite institutions. Everyday life, regional diversity, and non-elite perspectives are far less visible. Mud brick settlements, temporary structures, and organic materials are underrepresented due to preservation bias. As a result, Egyptology often emphasizes kings, temples, and tombs at the expense of ordinary experience. The abundance of material can also create a false sense of completeness. Large quantities of data do not eliminate uncertainty. Instead, they can mask gaps by creating dense, interpretive frameworks that appear internally consistent. When anomalies arise, they are often explained as exceptions rather than opportunities to question broader assumptions. This does not mean that Egyptology is rigid or dogmatic by nature. The field evolves continuously. New technologies such as remote sensing, digital epigraphy, and advanced dating techniques have transformed research. However, change tends to occur incrementally, working within established structures rather than replacing them entirely. Understanding Egyptology as a system highlights both its strengths and its limits. The discipline provides remarkable insight into one of humanity's longest-lasting civilizations, yet it remains shaped by historical assumptions, institutional continuity, and uneven evidence. Recognizing these constraints does not diminish its value. Instead, it allows for a more nuanced and responsible interpretation of what ancient Egypt can, and cannot, tell us about the past. One of the most revealing aspects of archaeology is not what it uncovers, but what it fails to preserve. Gaps and silences in the historical record are not anomalies. They are fundamental characteristics of how the past reaches the present. In the study of ancient Egypt, these absences are especially significant because they exist alongside an abundance of monumental evidence that can easily create the illusion of completeness. Much of what we know about Egypt comes from contexts designed to endure. Temples, pyramids, tombs, and stone inscriptions were constructed with permanence in mind. They represent the voice of the state, the priesthood, and the ruling elite. What they record reflects ideals rather than daily reality. Stability, order, and divine continuity dominate the narrative, while instability and disruption often disappear into silence. Entire chapters of Egyptian history are defined by what is missing rather than what survives. Periods such as the First and Second Intermediate periods are characterized by fragmentary evidence, regional variation, and a breakdown in centralized authority. In these times, monumental buildings slowed, inscriptions became rare, and written sources diminished. The absence of records does not imply societal collapse in every sense, but it does limit modern understanding of how people lived through these transitions. Administrative records once existed in vast quantities. Taxes, labor organization, legal disputes, and local governance would have generated extensive documentation. Yet most of these records were written on perishable materials, such as papyrus or wood. Over time, they decayed, burned, or were discarded. What survives is often accidental, preserved by unusual environmental conditions rather than deliberate archiving. Archaeological excavation itself contributes to silence. Many sites remain buried, unexplored, or destroyed before they are ever studied. Modern construction, agriculture, and looting erase layers of history faster than research can document them. Political instability and limited resources further restrict where and how archaeologists can work. The map of ancient Egypt that exists today is therefore shaped as much by modern circumstance as by ancient activity. Even when evidence exists, it does not always speak clearly. Fragmented inscriptions, damaged reliefs, and incomplete papyri require reconstruction. Scholars must infer missing sections, compare parallels, and propose restorations that remain hypothetical. Over time, these reconstructions can harden into accepted narratives, even though their foundations are uncertain. Silence also emerges from social perspective. The majority of Egypt's population left little trace of their voices. Farmers, laborers, women, and marginalized groups are underrepresented in surviving sources. Their experiences must be inferred indirectly through material remains, burial practices, and settlement patterns. This creates a history that is weighted toward power and visibility rather than demographic reality. The cumulative effect of these gaps is profound. Egypt appears continuous and stable, partly because disruptions are underdocumented. Change appears slow, because moments of transformation leave fewer traces. What is preserved shapes not only what we know, but how we imagine the past itself. Recognizing silence as evidence changes the way Egyptology is understood. Absence becomes a form of information, pointing to preservation bias, institutional priorities, and historical contingency. Rather than filling gaps with certainty, responsible interpretation acknowledges uncertainty as an integral part of reconstructing the ancient world. Archaeology and Egyptology do not merely uncover physical remains, they transform those remains into narratives. This process of interpretation is unavoidable. Artifacts, structures, and texts do not explain themselves. They must be organized, contextualized, and translated into coherent explanations that modern audiences can understand. Yet interpretation always exists at a distance, from the reality it seeks to describe. Every archaeological reconstruction is shaped by perspective. Scholars interpret evidence through the lens of contemporary knowledge, cultural assumptions, and methodological traditions. What appears logical or intuitive today may not reflect how ancient societies understood their own world. As a result, reconstructions often say as much about modern frameworks of thought as they do about ancient realities. In Egyptology, this tension is especially pronounced. Monumental architecture, artistic conventions, and written records create a powerful visual and symbolic coherence. Temples align with cosmic principles, reliefs depict orderly processions, and texts emphasize divine harmony. These elements encourage interpretations of Egypt as a civilization defined by stability, uniform belief, and centralized control. Yet this image may obscure complexity rather than reveal it. Artistic representation illustrates this problem clearly. Egyptian art follows strict conventions that prioritize symbolic meaning over naturalistic depiction. Figures are shown in composite views, scale reflects status rather than physical proportion, and scenes follow ritual logic rather than narrative realism. When modern viewers interpret these images literally, they risk mistaking symbolic systems for documentary records. Texts pose similar challenges. Inscriptions often present idealized versions of events. Kings defeat enemies, maintain cosmic order, and act with divine authority. Failures, internal conflicts, and uncertainty are minimized or excluded. Administrative texts focus on function rather than lived experience. Religious texts express theological ideals rather than everyday belief. Interpreting these sources requires constant negotiation between intention and information. Reconstruction amplifies interpretive distance. Museums, documentaries, and illustrations transform fragments into complete scenes. Colors are restored, structures rebuilt, and rituals reenacted. These reconstructions are valuable educational tools, but they also create an illusion of certainty. Viewers encounter finished images rather than fragmentary evidence, often unaware of how much interpretation fills the gaps. Even language introduces distortion. Modern terms such as state, religion, economy, or science do not map neatly onto ancient Egyptian concepts. Translating ancient ideas into contemporary categories risks simplifying or misrepresenting them. What modern scholars label as religious may have been inseparable from governance, law, or daily practice. Interpretation requires approximation, but approximation carries consequences. Interpretive frameworks also shape what questions are asked. Research priorities influence excavation strategies, funding decisions, and publication focus. Topics that align with existing narratives receive attention, while others remain peripheral. Over time, this reinforces dominant interpretations and marginalizes alternative perspectives. Reality becomes filtered through institutional momentum. Disagreement within the field further illustrates interpretive limits. Scholars often debate the meaning of the same evidence, proposing different explanations based on identical data. These debates are not signs of failure, but they reveal how evidence underdetermines interpretation. Multiple reconstructions can coexist, each plausible within its own assumptions. The passage of time deepens this uncertainty. Cultural meanings shift, languages evolve, and symbolic systems lose their original context. No amount of technical precision can fully recover subjective experience. Archaeology can reconstruct structures, sequences, and patterns, but inner worlds remain largely inaccessible. Understanding the distinction between interpretation and reality does not undermine archaeology or Egyptology. Instead, it clarifies their scope. These disciplines do not resurrect the past exactly as it was. They construct informed representations based on incomplete evidence. Their strength lies not in certainty, but in transparency about limits. Recognizing interpretive distance encourages caution in how conclusions are presented and consumed. It invites openness to revision and humility in claims of knowledge. The past, especially one as distant and complex as ancient Egypt, cannot be fully recovered. It can only be approached through layers of interpretation, each shaped by evidence, method, and human perspective. After examining evidence, methods, gaps, and interpretation, a central question remains. What do we actually know about the ancient past, and where does knowledge end? Archaeology and Egyptology have produced extraordinary insights into human history. Yet their achievements are often misunderstood as completeness rather than approximation. Understanding the distinction between knowledge and uncertainty is essential for engaging with the past responsibly. What archaeology knows is grounded in material reality. Structures existed. Tools were made and used. Settlements expanded, contracted, and disappeared. In Egypt, temples were constructed, rituals performed, administrations organized, and landscapes transformed through human effort. These facts are supported by physical remains that can be measured, compared, and analyzed. They form the solid core of archaeological knowledge. Chronologies, though imperfect, provide relative order. Cultural sequences can be traced. Patterns of continuity and change can be identified across centuries. Technologies evolved. Artistic conventions shifted. Political systems reorganized. These broad trends are visible across the archaeological record and allow historians to outline long-term processes with reasonable confidence. Yet beyond this foundation lies a vast territory of uncertainty. Archaeology rarely explains motivation, belief, or lived experience with precision. It cannot fully recover how individuals understood their world, how they felt about authority, or how they interpreted moments of crisis and change. These dimensions leave faint traces, if they survive at all. Much of what is presented as historical narrative is therefore interpretive synthesis. Scholars connect fragments into plausible stories, guided by evidence but shaped by inference. These narratives are necessary for understanding, but they are not identical to the past itself. They are representations constructed under constraint. In the case of ancient Egypt, this tension is especially visible. The civilization appears stable and continuous partly because its ideological systems emphasized order and permanence. Monumental architecture and formalized art reinforce this image. At the same time, archaeological gaps reveal periods of fragmentation, adaptation, and transformation that resist simple explanation. Stability and change coexist in ways that challenge linear storytelling. Uncertainty should not be seen as failure. It is a natural consequence of temporal distance. No historical discipline can fully reconstruct a society separated by thousands of years. What matters is how uncertainty is acknowledged and managed. Responsible scholarship distinguishes between evidence, interpretation, and speculation, even when the boundaries between them are subtle. Modern audiences often seek definitive answers. Clear conclusions are more satisfying than open questions. Yet, the past does not offer the clarity of a closed system. It resists final explanation. Each new discovery reshapes existing models rather than completing them. Knowledge expands, but certainty rarely follows at the same pace. Recognizing this dynamic changes how archaeology and Egyptology are valued. Their purpose is not to deliver absolute truth, but to refine understanding. They operate through accumulation, correction, and debate. Their strength lies in their capacity to adapt as new evidence emerges and new methods develop. The limits of these disciplines also invite humility. They remind us that modern perspectives are not privileged viewpoints outside history, but part of it. Future scholars will reinterpret today's conclusions just as current researchers revise earlier ones. Knowledge is provisional not because it is weak, but because it is alive. Ancient Egypt continues to fascinate not only because of what is known, but because of what remains unresolved. Questions persist about social organization, regional diversity, technological capability, and cultural change. These questions do not undermine existing knowledge. They expand its horizon. In the end, archaeology and Egyptology offer a dialogue with the past rather than a final verdict. They provide frameworks for understanding while leaving space for uncertainty. What we know is meaningful, but incomplete. What we do not know is not empty, but open. The past is not a finished story waiting to be uncovered. It is a complex landscape approached through fragments, interpretation, and continual revision. Accepting this does not diminish history. It deepens it.